Welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today we are discussing pollinator and wildlife-friendly solar with Rob Davis, the director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy at Fresh Energy in Minnesota. I'm so excited to bring this topic to Solar Works for Illinois. And before I introduce Rob and kick off the discussion in earnest with him, we are going to make a few announcements. We do this webinar monthly. Generally speaking, we will be dark in December, but in November, I'm thrilled to have two events. One is a face-to-face meeting of the Illinois Pollinator and Wildlife Friendly Solar Farm Working Group. I know that's a mouthful. I just call it the working group for short, but that's going to be November 14th in downtown Chicago. And then my good colleague, Harry Benson from Standard Solar is coming on the show on November 19th to talk about solar project finance, getting your project acquired and built. And that will have an emphasis on distributed generation. So you can look forward to that. And here's a poster for the working group event at the Palmer House Hilton on November 14th. And you can find all that at seco.com/pollinators. My guest today is Rob Davis, director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy at Fresh Energy. His work has been covered in many publications, including National Geographic, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Huffington Post. He's been featured, and his work has been featured in trainings by the U.S. Department of the Interior, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the Electric Power Resource Institute, otherwise known as EPRI. And Rob is so clearly on a mission to accelerate the nation's transition to the use of clean and renewable energy. And he's also been recognized by MENSIA, the Minnesota Solar Energy Industry Association, with the 2018 Excellence in Solar Policy Award. So it's just really great to have you here, Rob. Welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. Really appreciate you making time for us and our audience. And as you know, this is a very heady time in the Midwest. In Illinois, we have 3,000 megawatts under development now. And of course, Minnesota is an aspirational peer, and you have seen that market evolve over the last 7 years or so. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the topic.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Tim, and it's really encouraging to see these ideas of kind of best practices for vegetation management and project design be propagated and adopted into more and more states. The way that we got into this, we're an energy policy organization. So we've been around for more than 25 years as an energy policy organization, creating vibrant and dynamic markets for renewable energy. And our work on pollinator-friendly solar is really a way to anticipate the potential for opposition. So if we design ugly project after ugly project after ugly project, well, all we're doing is aggravating a lot of people, and that will significantly increase the cost of solar in the long term. However, if we're doing some design tweaks to be able to activate proponents of solar, particularly activate proponents of what's growing under and around the solar for folks that might not care about clean energy, then we as an industry will be much, much, much better off. I've heard it said to me several times by big utility scale wind developers or folks that do wind and solar, is that the solar market really needs to learn the lessons from the wind industry and be sure that every project we build as a solar industry is not one that is burning bridges with the local communities, that's not activating opponents, that instead is giving people a reason to support the clean energy and the economic development when they might not really care at all about the electrons or the technology. But it's been really rewarding to see that there are folks who care just as much about what grows under the panels as they do about a clean energy future for us all.
Yes. I love that emphasis on local constituents, because those constituents can make or break a solar project, as we have already seen in Illinois. When there is NIMBYism, it can really bite a solar developer in the butt.
Yeah.
and it can kill a project faster than you can say bumblebee. Um, so,
Yeah, it's a great turn of phrase.
so, and while we might think, I'm a vegetation ecologist by training, and of course I love pollinator friendly solar, just the concept of it, but people don't necessarily know what that means. So we definitely want you to dive into that. And I know that you have some slides that you're going to share with us, but that in and of itself is a potential challenge with local farmers, because let's face it, Illinois is mostly corn and beans. We have over 12 million acres in industrial ag, and solar farms are foreign to Illinois. We're going to get about 10,000 acres of solar farms in the next 5 to 10 years. And while that's a drop in the bucket in the greater scheme of things as a percentage of the landscape, for those communities where it's happening, here in Champaign County, where I live, we have a 1,600 acre site that is in the works by BayWa. So that's a big project. And, so far so good. They have met the hurdles and continue down the path. They have not broken ground on that project yet, but anyway, it is a little ironic, right, that you think you're doing the best thing ecologically for the land and for the community, but when people see what you and I might consider to be ecologically friendly vegetation, some people see weeds.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's absolutely true. Yeah, so I can absolutely provide some more context here. I'll share some of the visuals that I've created just for the conversation here. So I do encourage people to reach out to me, after the call. But if you've got additional questions, we'll get those taken care of right away. So this is absolutely, a response to seeing solar development that uses these kinds of approaches. So this is on arable land. This is another project on arable land. And you can imagine the reaction to farmers, from some farmers, in seeing, what might be prime land, but it's certainly at least, class 3 or 4 soils being covered up with, tons and tons of white rock. Never mind even the heat island effect that comes from designs like this, and the erosion, and good luck getting your soil, your water stormwater permit. So we knew that these kinds of designs would result in tension, and it certainly does. It certainly results in the whole issue being framed as farmers versus these out-of-state renewable energy solar developers. When you look at the land and you say, yeah, that's my power facility, I'm going to do whatever I want with what's inside the fence. That's a development approach that won't get you beyond one project in a county. That'll happen once, and then the folks who drive by that project every day will be organized and active to fiercely get those projects killed moving forward. That said, we here in Minnesota had passed some renewable energy policy back in 2013, both community solar law that required Xcel Energy to introduce a community solar program with no regulatory cap on the amount of megawatts, and then also a requirement on Xcel Energy to get 1.5% of its energy from solar by 2020. That resulted in some folks calling us and saying, shouldn't all of this land, shouldn't all this solar be on rooftops? And then we started a research project and found, pictures of this project by West Mill Solar Park in the United Kingdom, and Dr. Guy Parker, and called up Dr. Parker and had a great conversation with him, as well as Solstice Renewables there in the UK, and just heard all of what went wrong and what went right, and knew that this was a practice that could be imported to the United States, and a development approach that could be taken to scale. So the key, of course, is what constitutes pollinator friendly. Is Is it like these pictures that I'll show of, flowers upon flowers upon flowers, or is it something different? And the key is really with the entomologists. We in the solar advocacy world, we in the solar development world, we do not want to be in the position of trying to tell communities what's good for pollinators. So that is absolutely not our role, and it exposes a serious weakness if we try to do that. So the key is really working with the entomology community, the scientists who understand what kinds of landscapes and what kinds of things are good for bees and butterflies and pollinators. And so we reached out early on to Dr. Marla Spivak, who's a MacArthur Genius Award recipient. Her TED Talk on what's harming the honeybees has around 3 million views. And then also reached out to Dr. Karen Oberhauser, who's one of the nation's foremost monarch experts, and worked with them to understand how these landscapes could be beneficial within the operating constraints of a solar farm, how these landscapes could be beneficial. And the key is really around 2 words, and it's very simple. It's incremental and meaningful. If the seed mix design and the project design isn't an incremental change, then it probably won't get done, probably won't happen. But if it's not meaningful, then it's not worth doing. It actually could harm the industry. So putting a potted plant in the corner of a 40-acre field and getting the camera at just the right angle to get a single flower or a couple flowers in front of the camera with solar panels behind them, obviously that's not meaningful. And if those kinds of practices are used, then there's simply going to be a lot of distrust between the solar community and the local community. So the local community trusts the pollinator experts, the entomologists, with regards to what is meaningfully beneficial. And the solar industry can rely on the expertise of these folks to guide best practice. So the expression of that meaningful but incremental is expressed in a scorecard, and now actually a series of scorecards. So these pollinator-friendly solar scorecards are vetted by these expert entomologists. So you, as the solar developer, get to stand side by side with some of the world's foremost expert entomologists and say, hey, we're meeting or exceeding this standard. And so the questions in these documents are very simple. Percent wildflowers, percent native species, the diversity of those species, number of seasons flowering, signage, management plan, and insecticide risk. And so this document is now a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard is now available and published by the Department of Natural Resources in Illinois. And this scorecard is also backed up by the force of law. So similar to Minnesota, there is the Pollinator Friendly Solar Act passed in Illinois, I believe unanimously. It's a very simple law that says you can't call it beneficial to pollinators or pollinator friendly unless it meets or exceeds these standards. So it's a very simple truth in advertising law. No one wants to be buying milk and then open the container and have it be oil or orange juice or something else. So we all have trust in the definition and in the language. And by using the Pollinator Friendly Solar Scorecard in the state of Illinois, you as a developer are able to say, hey, look, we're meeting or exceeding these standards, and this is a net benefit for the state of Illinois. There's a lot more about the details of that scorecard and the value of specific pollinators as well. The Energy Resource Center at University of Illinois hosted a webinar on this topic about a little more than a year ago, and had Adam Dolezal on to talk about these scorecards, as well as had Dr. Rufus Isaacs from Michigan. He's one of the lead blueberry pollination ecologists in the state of Michigan. And so the two of them talked about the similarities between the scorecards for the states, but the vast differences between agriculture in the states. So Illinois is mostly corn and beans, also happens to be the nation's leading state for pumpkins, particularly pumpkin pie and kind of canned pumpkins, which do require pollination. By contrast, Michigan has the second most diversified agricultural economy after California. There's just all kinds of amazing fruits and blueberries and plums and apples and cranberries and things growing in Michigan, and all of those fruits are heavily dependent on pollinators. So this is just a fantastic tool, and since putting these into practice, it's been exciting to see that these things are really being embraced, and that they're actually cost effective. So PV Magazine says, less than penny a watt for pollinator friendly solar. Stearns County is actually adopting, and this is a county in Minnesota, is actually adopting this into their ordinances. And some developers, I think, would look at this and react negatively. I really encourage you as an industry to look at this as a significant net positive, because I know that we've all experienced there's all kinds of terrible things that can go into an ordinance. Earthen berms and wastewater containment basins, and all kinds of screening and setbacks, and those are largely extraordinarily expensive. And a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard as a permit condition is one of the most affordable and most helpful things that you can have as a permit condition, because it means that county is ready to push back on the NIMBYism and says, hey, we welcome the solar, and we also want the habitat. So usually we see these permit conditions take this kind of form, where it says the project shall be planned and developed in a way to meet these solar scorecards. And so instead of having headlines like this from the Journal sowing tension, we get headlines like this from the Journal just a couple of weeks ago. And this is a great transition. This is actually a pollinator-friendly solar project done by NG here south of St. Paul, Minnesota. So a bunch of examples of this. This is really taken off with national momentum. There's more and more civil engineers that are available to answer questions about how to do project design and implementation on these projects. More and more corporations and seed vendors and expertise in terms of how to do project implementation. Big benefits. So universities absolutely love this. Denison, University of Dayton, Penn State, more and more universities are saying, yeah, we don't just want clean electrons, we want the conservation and habitat benefits as well. Huge benefit as well is corporations. This is a huge opportunity for corporations to really do our marketing and PR for us as an industry. So corporations want pollinator-friendly solar. It was highlighted by Cliff Bar and Company, and I expect throughout the next years they'll have more and more, they'll be pushing on this more and more heavily. The National Renewable Energy Lab has a study, 25 sites nationwide. Cliff Bar is one of the pilot project sites that highlights this practice. So universities love it, corporations love it. More corporations, here's Purdue Farms talking about pollinator-friendly solar. And then co-ops, rural electric cooperatives love this. It really connects to their membership values. Here's Barb Nick, CEO of Dairyland Power, talking about pollinator-friendly solar. Xcel Energy is requiring the solar scorecard in their RFPs. So this is a freebie for utilities. I mean, this is really an opportunity for them to highlight successful projects, for you as solar developers to help the utility look good, and for you as a developer to stand out, to compete on price, but also propose projects that help the utility market your project and really push it to consumers. There's all kinds of benefits that we've identified. There are questions, and I expect that we'll get into some of that here during the call and the conversation. One of the things that I just wanted to highlight is for the first time earlier this year, National Renewable Energy Lab, in partnership with, I believe, University of Arizona, maybe it was Arizona State University, published a study proving for the first time that what grows under and around photovoltaic panels can meaningfully influence the amount of electricity generated. So on the right side of your screen, you see tomatoes growing results in a 16-degree cooler Fahrenheit microclimate under the panels, increasing PV generation by 2%. On the left side of your screen, bare ground, results in a heat island effect, and that's been proven in a number of different studies. What NREL is studying right now is how much cooling do you get or avoiding of heat from doing pollinator-friendly development. We know that thicker vegetation, and particularly forbs, those flower stems contain more water, so we would expect more transpiration from the flower stems. But the jury is still out on exactly how much energy production you get. What we do know as well is that in a warming world, we're going to have more and more and more days above 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're in Southern Illinois, if you're in Central Illinois, if you're thinking, how many days am I going to have in this state, in this market, above 77, just know that for every 2 degrees Fahrenheit above 77, your solar array is degrading in efficiency by 0.6%. So think about how to mitigate that negative effect of heat that will be increasing over the life of the project. And then, of course, compatibility with agriculture. So we've got a lot of content on this. Pollinator-friendly solar helps increase abundance of native pollinators that benefit these kinds of crops. This has a net positive benefit to a lot of different crops in a lot of different states. Some models even say that having a pollinator-friendly solar array can increase the abundance of crops outside the fence in a way that more than offsets the quote of land lost to crops inside the fence. So, those little bees really do a lot of work and produce a lot of value. So if there's more that you need in terms of compatibility with agriculture, those are issues you're running into, please do reach out to me, and we'll get you connected with some better stories. Another easier thing to do potentially than doing crops is just to have a good conversation with a beekeeper in the area or in the region. I wouldn't say inside the fence, I apologize for the photo, but certainly having hives outside the fence adjacent to a pollinator-friendly solar array is a huge net benefit. This is a great set of best practices here. We've published these in a variety of different beekeeping journals. And then there's great examples. So Light Source BP has harvesting solar farm honey. EDF Renewables in Canada is harvesting solar farm honey. And then Cliff Family Winery, they're buying, the Cliff Barn Company is buying pollinator-friendly SREX from a project in Iowa, and then also buying the solar-grown honey from the hives on the project and selling it today. And I believe they started last week on their website. So this is just a fun, really fun way to connect non-traditional audiences with the delicious taste of a clean energy future. And if honey isn't good enough for you, bringing some of that solar-grown honey to a brewery, like Fresh Energy has done now 4 or 5 or 6 times, to create these delicious products, that is a great way to activate supporters. I've seen it firsthand where someone says, I don't know about solar. These projects are so ugly. This is really good beer. So when you can put something on a plate or in a glass, it's a great way to demonstrate that you're clearly and obviously compatible with agriculture. Just some notes, conservation grazing is a practice we do recommend. It's rotational grazing, and that's totally compatible with pollinator habitat. Be sure that it's rotational. Because continuous grazing results in all kinds of negative unintended consequences, from poop on the panel to sheep attracting predators and stuff like that. Obviously, there's potential for carbon sequestration for the folks in your groups that are thinking about carbon markets or future markets for ecosystem services. Think about the potential for revenue that comes from these projects going from very shallow root and very little sequestered carbon over the lifetime of the project to really significant sequestered carbon. And then finally, be sure your project is, you're designing projects with a wildlife or deer fence. Those prison style fences are also compatible with electrical code, but the wildlife and deer fence are way more compatible with the agricultural kind of look and feel. And they do comply with electrical code as well. You can put 3 stems of, or 3 strings of barbed wire on the top. You can have a wildlife gap below, or you can have it go all the way to the ground. But these are just some of the techniques and tools to use solar design to activate supporters, to ensure that we're setting ourselves up for growth as an industry over the long term. So thanks for your time, and thanks, Tim, for the invitation to just share some information. I really look forward to the conversation here.
Great, thank you. Well, we already have a comment and a question, and you've given us a lot to think about, Rob. My head is spinning, and I'm a little more knowledgeable about this than the average person. But well, let's just deal with or address the comment or question from James about tomatoes. He asks if they're considered pollinator friendly. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, sure. It certainly is a crop that has a flower. It has nectar and pollen. It's amazing that a lot of people don't know that the turfgrass has no real meaningful benefit to pollinators. It does, it does provide some negligible amount of pollen, but these grasses provide little to, well, they provide no nectar. While tomatoes are a pollinator dependent crop, we're not going to be planting fields of tomatoes or probably on solar projects. I don't see that as likely.
Sure. So, what's standing out here for me is there's going to be many flavors of pollinator and wildlife friendly solar. First of all, it's not going to be a cookie cutter approach. And then there's going to be a mix of pollinator and other uses like rotational grazing, which is great, to have multiple uses from your solar farm. And that's one of the points of this. And the other thing that really is on my mind, I guess, is drainage. Illinois, being so flat, has a lot of issues with flooding, both on ag land and other land. And it does seem like planting deep-rooted prairie plants is going to improve the drainage of a site. Yes, that's a lovely illustration of that. And do you think that the authorities having jurisdiction in Illinois will recognize that?
Yeah, it really depends on the messenger. So I'm sure we've all experienced it when a solar developer says something, the folks in the audience or on the AHJ often discount it and say, oh, well, you'll say anything to get your project approved. But when you can bring in, someone from Prairie Restorations or Minnesota Native Landscapes or Applied Ecological Services or Pheasants Forever, when you can bring in, even someone such as yourself, Tim, that has a background in native plants, in ecology, in activating these kinds of landscapes, then that is an authentic messenger to address the topic of performance stormwater infiltration. National Renewable Energy Lab is also, through the INSPIRE study, is also doing some measurements with regards to stormwater infiltration and depth. I would certainly hope that slides like this and educational materials like this can help people, can help the AHJs understand that, our states used to be covered with this stuff. They used to be absolutely covered with this stuff. And it's said that I think the first quarter inch of rain doesn't even hit the ground, in a prairie or in a meadow like this. So the capacity of these plants to infiltrate water faster and deeper than turf grass or other land uses has been proven in a variety of different studies from USGS. There was a study out of Wisconsin that compared the performance of rain gardens with turf grass versus rain gardens with native grasses in Forbes. So yeah, there's significant and meaningful performance differences when it comes to stormwater benefits, and those should be modeled, and then those recommendations should be made to the HJs.
Great. So to everybody on the show today, you can type in questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll both Rob and I can see all of those. So please keep those coming. And Andy made a comment that he was in Pennsylvania and they were referring to solar farming as opposed to just solar farms. And I think that is a nice distinction and a way to emphasize that there is still a farming component to solar once the the field is converted, let's just say from corn and beans to solar.
Yeah.
So that's a good distinction.
It's a good distinction, and I'm fairly consistent in referring to solar as a specialty crop. So nationwide, specialty crops aren't well represented. I mean, they do have trade associations, but compared to corn and beans, corn and soybeans, and cotton and wheat and the other major commodities, solar is more like strawberries. It's more like pumpkins. It's more like watermelon. So it's really going to be developed in these niche areas, i.e., areas that happen to be near a substation or near flat land and a substation or an interconnection point. And the amount of acreage is going to be such that it's comparable with these kinds of specialty crop productions. There are still lots of communities that react very, very fiercely. In Maryland, for example, I believe you're not even supposed to call it a solar farm. You're just supposed to call it a solar facility. But I think with more projects in the ground that show good design and that are really compatible with agriculture, we can help repair some of the damage that's been done by some of the ugly projects.
Yeah, we need to remember this industry is very new, and while the technology is mature and certainly tried and true, how we apply it on the landscape is new. And of course that varies tremendously from state to state. I've been scrutinizing the list of states that are, have significant amounts of solar. I call it the gigawatt club. There are now 14 states with a gigawatt or more of solar. Illinois is not on that list yet, but we will be in 5 years. And Minnesota is on that list. They have 1,200 plus megawatts or 1.2 gigawatts of solar. So it is an evolution, and that's interesting though that in some places you can't call them solar farms.
Yeah, I was out at the Verge conference last week, and then in September I was down at Solar Power International, and in both places at SPI I presented with Lexi Hain of the American Solar Grazing Association. And at the Verge conference, I presented with Michael Baude of Silicon Ranch, and both of those two folks are grazers. They're solar grazers. They're managing flocks of sheep. They're to get meaningful ecological benefits and facility benefits from their solar farms. So it's encouraging to see the way they're thinking about solar landscapes, and they're really using grazing as a land management practice to benefit ecosystems and to benefit soil carbon and to benefit stormwater control. So I definitely encourage everyone on the webinar to be thinking about new paradigms. This is not a gas-fired power plant. This is not a coal-fired power plant. The facilities management techniques you had for those kinds of operations simply don't apply here. And we need to be cognizant of all of the land that we'll be using for these solar facilities.
What I'm so excited about is that if we do this right, the land that we're taking out of crop rotation and into pollinator and wildlife friendly solar could become organic farm ground after 25 years of having a solar farm on it. And, 80% of Illinois was prairie, as you mentioned, prior to European settlement. So it is very much a natural part of the ecosystem traditionally. And there's so much room for us to let a small percentage of that come back, and solar can be part of that. Are you at all familiar with the Land Institute in Kansas?
Oh yeah, very, very closely familiar. Actually, the beer that I featured in the slide, Solarama Crush, is just a fantastic hazy IPA that was introduced 2 years ago. And it uses three extraordinary hero ingredients. One is solar grown honey harvested from flowering solar farms. Second is 100% pollinator friendly SREX. So it's made with 100% clean energy. And the third is Kernza, this deep rooted perennial wheat that's being advanced and propagated by the Land Institute of Salinas, Kansas. So it's great that this is a beverage we can all drink and celebrate, both in support of renewable energy, as well as in support of climate change solutions of sequestering more carbon into the soil. But yeah, the Land Institute is a great organization.
Great, thank you. And thank you, James, for your excellent questions and comments. Spencer has a comment from Invenergy. One issue I have run into, he says, is ensuring that EPC contractors effectively implement native grass/pollinator solutions when A, their involvement with the project ends at final completion, and B, the most effective methods of planting, including seed drilling and culti-packing, are not possible given most construction timelines. Do you have any advice for solving this issue? That's a great question. And yes, there are many practical challenges to this. What do you say about that, Rob?
Yeah. I would really allow the competitive marketplace to address those issues. So for folks that aren't getting quite the right outcome from one set of vendors, they have competitors. And there's no shortage of opinions of experts that will be delighted to step into someone else's kitchen and say, "Oh no, they did the wrong thing. Let me help you get the right practice here." So I would definitely take that insight to the native landscape industry and say, "Hey, here's the challenges that we've had. We've tried to phase in this approach, but we ran into these stumbling blocks. What else have you got for us?" So I think that the landscape management industry and the EPCs, they need to hear that feedback, and they need to be looking for solutions in a very aggressive way to address those issues.
Good. And what about permaculture? Another person asked, do you know of any permaculture projects?
The closest I can think of potentially it would be Silicon Ranch. So they're, I think, 42% owned by Shell. And they are bringing projects to scale that use these kinds of permaculture practices. They call it regenerative energy. And they have a different model, though. They're building and owning. So they're owning the land, and then they're owning the projects. But they have a couple thousand acres of solar in Georgia that they're grazing and managing in this way. There's other projects that are doing, so example, in the Arizona desert or in Arizona, they're doing some cropping underneath. In Massachusetts, we're seeing more elevated panels and farming underneath. Massachusetts only has 500,000 acres of farmland, though, compared to several million we have in Illinois and Minnesota. So I think that as more and more solar comes along, that more developers will want to have the skill set of pollinator friendly solar and of co-location of solar and agriculture. They'll need to have that skill set to address the permitting and siting issues that we will definitely be facing in the near future.
Yeah, there are many structural challenges, and this harkens back to Spencer's question too. You know, we see a lot of developers, including pollinator friendly in their RFPs, but the reality is they themselves are many times short-term owners in terms of the development cycle. And so while you might build the project to be initially pollinator friendly in terms of doing some initial planting, getting pollinator friendly landscape established is a multi-year process, not a 6-month process. And so the developers have to work with their constituents and their process and recognize that if they're flipping it at NTP, they need to pass the baton to somebody else, to the long-term owner, about, you know, with regards to maintenance. And so
Yeah.
much of this does come down to maintenance, operations and maintenance, O&M as we call it. But let's talk about that a little bit, Rob. The, you know, the cost.
Let me interrupt you there for
Yeah,
just a
sure.
moment. I apologize. I've got to grab a power cable, but I'll be right back. I'm so
Okay, no problem.
sorry.
And just for the attendees, while Rob is getting his cable, if you put, I think you can type chats in that everybody can see. So if you're wanting to put questions to the audience as a whole, put them in the chat, and then people can share knowledge with each other in the background here as we go along. And then for anybody who isn't familiar, we do share the slides on the website at seco.com/solar webinar. So all the recordings and PDFs of slides are available there, and we'll get a copy of Rob's slides and make those available. So no worries. But then also check out the other recordings that we have there, because it's a great library now on all kinds of topics, both Illinois solar specific and national topics like net zero construction. Just looking at the Q&A here. Keep the questions coming, people. This is a great opportunity to talk to a nationally recognized expert, Rob Davis from the Center for Pollinators and Energy at Fresh Energy. And also, for anybody who wasn't on the event when we kicked off, want to highlight that on November 14th, we're having a face-to-face meeting of the working group. That's the Pollinator and Wildlife Friendly Solar Farm Working Group that we've established here at Continental Electrical. That meeting is going to be in downtown Chicago, and you can find information about that and RSVP at cecco.com/pollinators. That's the landing page for that working group. We've been meeting every other month, mostly virtually for the last 6 months or so. But because Solar Power Midwest overlapped with our working group, we decided to get a room in the same hotel where Solar Power Midwest is happening. So you have that to look forward to. Also, if you're a developer or an EPC working in Illinois, you should definitely come to Chicago November 14 and 15 for that event. And then, and you can find all of those mentioned also at the cecco.com/solar webinar. It looks like we lost Rob. I guess he ran out of power on his computer, which is a bummer, but hopefully he'll find that and get back into the webinar here shortly. keep the questions coming. I have a queue of questions myself for Rob. We're going to talk about what are the cost benefit analysis that developers, EPCs, and landowners can do. So in other words, if you're trying to figure out what are the costs and benefits of pollinator friendly solar, how do you do that analysis? What are the success stories around the Midwest? Rob mentioned some of those, and but I want to highlight some of those more. NG is the developer I'm most familiar with that is doing pollinator friendly solar farm development around the country. I know that Cypress Creek is also doing that in some states where they're working, including New York State. Hopefully, Illinois is also a state where they're going to do pollinator friendly projects. They have a quite sizable portfolio, I think on the order of 17 community solar projects. If anybody wants more information about where all these solar farms are going to be, you can go to the Illinois Power Agency website. You can go to Illinois Shines, which is the public website for the adjustable block program. And you can go to Path to 100, which is also a very important resource for the solar industry here in Illinois. At Path to 100, they have a great map of the 111 community solar farms that won RECs in the lottery this past May, and the additional 700 that are now on the wait list for community solar. So that is the power of a REC market when a state launches valuable RECs for renewable energy. That's renewable energy credits. 1 megawatt hour of electricity from a renewable energy project is one REC. It gets the attention, and you now all of a sudden have dozens and dozens of developers and others in the ecosystem coming to your state. And there's a lot of job creation. There's a lot of economic development now. And the economics of solar farms are great for landowners and farmers too. A farmer can make 3 times more rent on their ground renting to a solar farmer than they can cash cropping that land. So it's definitely a win-win-win for the local community, and obviously it can be an ecological boon as well. And that's our goal, is to make solar as ecologically friendly as possible.
I apologize for the disruption there, Tim.
No worries. It looks like we're getting Rob back. He's on the phone at least. We can hear you now.
Great. Yeah, I apologize. I missed it by 10 seconds of going to zero power. I thought it was at around 100% this morning. Anyway,
yeah.
Let's get into the questions.
Okay, good. Well, the big one is, tell us about doing that cost benefit analysis that developers, EPCs, and landowners can do when comparing different, possible outcomes for their solar farms.
Absolutely. I think the first and most important cost benefit analysis is to do to look at the direction that the market is going. So, within our own lifetimes, we've experienced the fact that Blockbuster thought it was too expensive to go, a whole bore into an online only video rental service. And they bore the result of that. So today in the United States, there's only around 250,000 acres of solar. And by 2030, we'll have either somewhere between 2 million, according to NREL, or 4 million, according to Hunter Levins, acres of solar. And so, yes, there have been projects that have been extraordinarily difficult, that have been killed, that have been held over, whether they eventually got permitted or eventually died. But if you think that has been the worst, it's easy days. It's easy days. We need more and more innovation in solar farm design and innovation in solar management, because more conflict is coming. More conflict is coming. So we really, as an industry, we have to sound the alarm within our management structures that if we want to continue to lead and continue to grow and continue to build these projects, the developers that are already embracing innovation and already finding ways to bring pollinator-friendly solar designs to scale, or other agriculturally savvy designs to scale. Those are the projects and the developers that will win. So I encourage you to really reflect on the competitive market and whether your costs over the next 5 years will be increasing in solar design and development and getting those projects permitted, or whether those costs will be flat or even decreasing. So that's the first step. The next step is really to look at, find a way, get an intern, find a graduate student to really get a sense of what you're spending today. And there's so many companies that I've run into that really have no idea what they're paying per acre, what their total all-in costs are per acre to manage these projects. And once you know that number, are you accounting for the number of solar mower collisions? Are you accounting for the downtime from damaged panels? And once you know those all-in costs, then you know the number to beat. And I think that there's fairly clear and evident story to tell to say that doing turf grass is kind of like building a house in Minnesota without insulation. It's amazing how cheap you can build it. It's same when I see these advertisements for cable trays and externally suspended cables, and just think about the O&M cost. That might be a one-time cost savings in terms of developing the project because you don't have to bury the cables, but the lifetime cost is considerably higher. So whether your business is an originator or whether it's an operator and owner, be thoughtful about how the projects that you're developing are either helping the long-term market or potentially hurting the long-term market.
Rob, in your presentation, you mentioned that by some calculations, it takes a penny a watt to make a solar project pollinator friendly. Do you have anything to compare that to? Because mowing, if it's just turf grass and they're mowing it to keep the weeds down, that's not cheap. Do you have any numbers about the comparison?
Yeah. I mean, I would. I know that Argonne National Lab has done some cost analysis between establishment of turf grass and the inputs that are necessary. So again, looking at the all-in costs, and then the all-in costs for establishing a high performance landscape. Usually, I would also say is probably a pollinator-friendly landscape. So reduced mowing is a area of savings. Better performance in terms of stormwater, fewer collisions in terms of with the panels. I mean, obviously that has a great degree to which is influenced by the height of your panels. I hope that in the Midwest, folks are developing at least 24 inches, ideally. The best practice recommended by NREL is 32 to 36 inches. So hopefully that you're already putting your panels up out of harm's way. And then you can simply do a calculation to say, well, how many mows do we have to do per year? How many mows will be required with turf grass? What kind of performance do we expect from turf grass in an increasingly volatile climate? I would expect that over the life of the project, we'll see lots and lots of periods of drought and lots of downpours. And turf grass does not do well with drought or downpours. So I was contacted by a large utility in the southeast who was sharing the fact that their turf grass was just dying all over the place. It wasn't just spotty, it was just dying acre by acre. And they were concerned about the risk of erosion once that site would get hit by a downpour. That turf grass is going to die, and then it's just going to sheet off and be in the adjacent waterway. So you really have to be thinking about how to build something for resilient and give you the kind of performance that we need in a volatile climate situation.
Vic asks about pollinator-friendly impacts on community solar. And, I'm just thinking from your perspective, Rob, what are the success stories in the Midwest so far? If maybe you could speak to the Minnesota market on some back of the envelope level, what percentage of community solar projects in Minnesota are working to apply pollinator friendly, and how's that going?
Yeah, in Minnesota, we see between a third and a half of all of the community solar projects embracing a pollinator friendly approach. Again, we think that's smart for the market, and nationwide we have more than 40 million acres of turf grass, and if we develop more and more projects that look like suburban soccer fields with some glass and steel above them, then we are simply giving our opponents more and more ammunition to come back and say this is a completely incompatible use. This is clearly development in an agricultural area, and we should have a moratorium, no more solar farms. So so we are seeing that in areas where solar is using the pollinator friendly approach, where it's being designed thoughtfully to have these kind of agricultural values that anecdotally the opposition has not been as fierce as we've seen in other places. So I get that it's hard to put that into a spreadsheet to say, hey, we're helping prevent a moratorium, which could come a year or more from now. But that's kind of the position that we're all in, as trying to grow a market and help ensure that what we're building today is a net asset to us and is really helping us tomorrow. And making sure that we can go back for the second and third and fourth and fifth project in any given community is extremely valuable. And I've seen it firsthand where a planning commission, hears everything from the developer, and then they hear from a vegetation manager, and then they hear from a beekeeper, and they're like, I'm really not in support of this, but, it feels like you came here asking for a solar project, and it feels like we're getting a free park out of this thing. And that's kind of exactly the position that we want to put these AHJs in, is the position where they don't really like the solar, but there's enough other stuff that's there that they're familiar with. They're familiar with conservation reserve CRP. They're familiar with the plight of the pollinators. They're familiar with the significant shortfall in the pheasant population and or game bird population, and to give them a reason to vote yes when they could otherwise just vote no.
Is there a concern about endangered species if you build your project to be more pollinator friendly? I'm thinking of the monarch, for example. We do have some special initiatives in Illinois to preserve and create monarch habitat, but can that come back to bite the developer in the long run if you do create habitat? I'm just curious.
If you're not planning for it, then it would be a surprise. But I think that folks are, by and large, have had a lot of those conversations, and have either taken the steps that they need to, or have satisfied the obligations that they felt that they need to satisfy. What we know is that from small developers to some of the world's most well-resourced, largest companies, including NG, including Enel Green Power, division of Enel Global, with 84th largest company in the world. They're moving forward and embracing pollinator-friendly solar as a best practice. Now, at some scale, yes, you want to make sure that your land lease contracts allow you to revert the land back to its original state, and that on a case-by-case basis, you may want to have a simple conversation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife about a safe harbor agreement or a CCAA. A safe harbor agreement is in the case where a species has already been listed and you want to create habitat that could help potentially that species. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a process whereby you would be allowed to revert the land back to its original state, no harm, no foul. And then the CCAA it's called a candidate conservation agreement with assurances. And it basically says, hey, there's some species that are not yet listed, like the monarch, and we want to create habitat for them. And so you can become part of this CCAA process. And that's a way of kind of making sure that you're covering, you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, and you're covering yourself legally. But there's absolutely, well-known, well-trod programs in place. U.S. Fish and Wildlife was very clear. They want and they celebrate developers, solar developers that are doing the right thing. And so they want to work with you and to incentivize this kind of outcome. So definitely don't be shy about, touching base, calling U.S. Fish and Wildlife, talking to them, and doing your homework on safe harbor agreements and CCAA.
Great. And I don't know if you have time for a few more questions, Rob. It's 12:04 now.
I'm good for a few more. You bet.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologize for the power interruption. I'm not even in the roving blackout area. So
no worries. So what about pesticides? Ahmad asks about pesticides when you have to use them to kill the existing grass or weeds. And of course, the devil is in the details here. It depends on what pesticide and what exactly the circumstances are. I have noticed that a lot of the landscape installers do want to treat, if the site already has like turf grass on it, they do want to kill that. Do you have any comments or opinions about that practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would first just advise to not use the word pesticide, and instead be more specific and talk about either herbicide or insecticide. So pesticide is a bigger umbrella term that kind of applies to anything you don't want. And so herbicides like Roundup, like glyphosate, are tools in the toolbox for your landscapers. And I've spoken at great length with a variety of the folks on the Xerxes team, and they actually recommend that if you want the best outcome and you're dealing with a turf grass area, you want the best pollinator meadow, you have little or to no chance of trying to get flowers and prairie to outcompete the turf grass. So you need to terminate the turf grass, and so Roundup is a recommended, used by a licensed a licensed vendor. That's kind of a recommended best practice to help get successful pollinator habitat. Longer term, herbicides can be spot spraying. So there can be backpacks that are used with people that are knowledgeable in recognizing weed species. And so they can be, again, a tool in the toolbox to help them manage your landscape. It's really important to be working with landscape contractors, landscape partners that are knowledgeable. If you're only hiring people that have a single tool, a mower, then there's only a single thing they can do, and that's mow it. So when they run across a patch of Canadian thistle on your solar farm, they probably, if they only have a mower, then they probably haven't had sufficient training to recognize that it's about to drop, that each plant is about to drop 400,000 seeds on your solar project. And then they probably wouldn't know that when they mow that patch of Canadian thistle, that all those seeds are going to get tracked into the mower tire treads, and then they're going to bring it to your next project. So definitely be thoughtful about hiring landscape partners that are as concerned with establishing a perennial low-growing meadow as you are, and that they know how to identify plants and to use the proper tools, whether that's an herbicide or manual extraction or mowing or something else.
So when we look forward in Illinois, Rob, what are you hearing? We mentioned in the pre-show, or we discussed briefly, that the University of Illinois has a new solar farm being developed. It's a 57-acre project, and Sol Systems from Washington, D.C. is the winning developer on that project, and they've made a public announcement that they're going to do pollinator friendly. Are there other projects you're aware of? I can speak to what I see as well. But what are you seeing moving forward in Illinois?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for Illinois because Illinois is has just some of the most exciting corporations and universities and brands, not just in the United States, but in the world. So, looking forward to next year, we'll have the 50th anniversary of Earth Day right away in April. And then we'll have National Pollinator Week in June and Biodiversity Day in May. And there's just this series of events that where companies, brands, corporations, universities will want to be touting their environmental creds. And as solar has become a commodity, and clean energy buyers have gone from seeing one proposal for solar to 10, that I would expect more and more corporations and universities and municipalities to be looking for additional environmental attributes from those solar projects. So so as you think about what's going to happen in 2020, I would absolutely expect that the corporations like NG and IPS and US Solar and other developers that have made commitments to do pollinator-friendly development in Illinois, I would expect those folks to be activating their marketing teams and their public relations teams, and that we'll hear more and more and more about solar plus habitat throughout Illinois.
Great. Well, I think we will wrap up, Rob, for the sake of everybody's time. We will post the recording, as I said, here at seco.com/solar webinar. Please do join us in November for Harry Benson on November 19th. And please do consider coming to Chicago for the working group on pollinator-friendly solar, as well as Solar Power Midwest. And that's November 14 for the working group, November 14-15 for the SEIA Solar Power Midwest. And I want to thank you, Rob, for joining us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. This is a great resource you're delivering and providing for the state, and so my hat's off to you. And thanks to everyone that's tuning in. Look forward to being in more closer collaboration and work with you in the next several months.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. For SolarWorks for Illinois, I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow solar. Have a great day.